upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. Birds fly over the rainbow. Why then, oh, why can't I? If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why can't
Hi everyone, this is Jeffrey McAlpine, the 7th period teacher. Great to have you back for Classroom Culture 111. This is our third part on cross-curricular micro-planning using the McAlpine frame. And this episode, I'm going to look across the curriculum. We're going to apply the micro-frame planning to math, reading, writing, and social studies, looking at some common micro-plans that you would find in those subjects, and then we're going to revise those micro-plans in order to increase the engagement and in order to change the classroom culture. So we're going to be taking some traditional tools and we're going to alter them to include the 3 Higher Whiteboarding Toolbox, the Teach Like a Champion Toolbox, the Cooperative Learning Toolbox, and the Whole Brain Teaching Toolbox. And just like in The Wizard of Oz, I'm going to present the traditional tools and the traditional way of micro-planning in black and white. And we're going to look at some very famous video clips of some very famous teachers who you might recognize. While they are fictional teachers, they do represent the public's perception of what school is because of the use of traditional tools. And so we're going to look at some movie clips from some of my favorite videos of teachers that inspired me when I was growing up. And you might recognize some of them. But just because they are inspirational teachers in movies doesn't mean that what they represent is great instruction. And so we're going to look at some of these videos and we're going to alter the instruction. Just as a quick review, let's remember the McAlpine micro-planning frame. So we start with an element, that's what we're going to think about. Then we have an interaction, that's how our brain is going to interact with that, how our brain's going to think about it. Then we have a tool, this is how we're going to prove that we're thinking about it. And then we have immediate feedback. How are we going to revise our response or how are we going to extend our response? And then finally we have revision. How are we going to prove that we've revised or extended our response? That is the micro frame, and we're going to use that to alter some of these lessons. All right, I'm starting with one of my favorite movies growing up. I remember watching this when I was young with my family and watching Robin Williams as the teacher and thinking, wow, he's such an amazing teacher. We're going to go ahead and throughout this session, I'm going to be showing you the video clips. And while I'm showing them to you, underneath the clip, it's going to show you the traditional micro-planning. I've taken the video clips from the movie and I have scripted out the micro-planning below. It gives us a good description of the choices that this teacher is making to create that moment-to-moment culture with their students. So let's go ahead and watch this first clip from the Dead Poets Society. Keep an eye underneath the video clip at the micro-planning and what it looks like. And one thing I'm going to mention at the end of this video is one way to definitely practice this is to video record your own lessons and write out the micro-planning that you see and then revise them. All right, let's take a look.
A man is not very tired, he is exhausted. And don't use very sad. Use, come on, Mr. Overstreet, you twerp.
Morose?
Exactly, morose. Now, language was developed for one endeavor, and that is, Mr. Anderson, come on, are you a man or an amoeba? Mr. Perry.
To communicate.
No, to woo women. Today we're going to be talking about William Shakespeare.
Oh, God.
I know. A lot of you look forward to this about as much as you look forward to root canal work. We're going to talk about Shakespeare is someone who writes something very interesting. Now, many of you have seen Shakespeare done very much like this. "O Titus, bring your friend hither." But if any of you have seen Mr. Marlon Brando, no, that Shakespeare can be different. France, Romans, countrymen. Let me rest. You can also imagine maybe John Wayne as Macbeth going, "Well, is this a dagger I see before me?" Dogs, sir? Oh, not just now. I do enjoy a good dog once in a while, sir. You can have yourself a 3-course meal from one dog. Start with your canine crudité, go to your Fido flambe for main course, and for dessert, a Pekingese parfait.
A beautiful clip from that show, but some very traditional teaching. Let's go ahead and defy some tradition. Let's march ourselves over the rainbow and go from black and white and add some color. The element that Mr. Keating decides to use is the memory of a vocab word that means not very sad. And he cold calls a student, and he says, "A man is not very tired, he is, come on, what is it?" So notice he's cold calling. That student didn't know they were being called on. They didn't have any time to think about their response. One of the things that this particular teacher or professor tends to do is make fun of his students. So not only are they called on just on the spot, he also activates their amygdala. They're afraid of him in a way, and so a lot of them get frozen, and you see the deer in the headlights look with this, and this is what happens with a lot of cold calling. Very, very traditional way of treating students. Thinking back to the video before, cold calling creates a negative culture, a culture of being scared in a classroom. And so while it might make for some good film, it doesn't make for some good classroom culture. The immediate feedback is pretty traditional. He says yep or no, and he provides the answer, and there's no real revision. He never comes back to the student. So to me, it looks like this teacher, this professor, is just making things up as he goes along. But let's alter this. Let's change this microplan. So the element I have to alter. It's going to be a list of potential vocabulary words that could fill in for very sad. So let's do this, right? Let's really, if we're looking for something that means not very sad, I want a long list. Here's a bunch of words that could mean not very sad. And then the task that students are going to have to complete is to list as many words as you can that mean very sad. We're going to do some boarding. So students will have their whiteboards in front of them. They'll be doing open boarding, so they'll be creating a list of what they could put instead of very sad. And then we're going to do some immediate feedback after a little while, where the teacher is walking around and the teacher is looking for positive, happy things that students are saying and shouts them out for students to add that to their board. So whenever the teacher sees a great one, they shout it out, students all add it to their board. Every once in a while, I'm going to pause them and I'm going to say pass. And then students are going to pass their whiteboard to someone around them. And then what happens is they read the words on the list and they continue to add. So now they're also getting feedback from their peers around them as well. And so the revision is they're going to continue adding to the board, and after 3 passes, they're going to circle the word that they think is definitely the best one that would go into that sentence. So you see what I've done here. I've taken a nonchalant little tiny piece of a reading class where it's just asking about what word fills in the blank, and I've turned it into a very engaging, interactive experience for students where all students have to show their thinking, and they have nice peer support. Notice cold calling creates a culture of being scared in a classroom. But with this particular frame, they're getting teacher support. I'm saying things positively out loud that they could add to their board, and they're getting peer support. Their peers are helping them as well. So we've taken that culture of being scared. And I think if I was in Mr. Keating's classroom, I probably would be. And he uses that as a technique to keep his students on the edge of their seats. I think that in real life, that technique would probably turn a lot of students against him. All right, so next, he asks the question, what is the one endeavor language was developed for? So the element, when you think about it, is really a student's life experience of how they communicate or why they communicate. So he hasn't taught them anything. He's asking them a question that's related to their life experience. And so it makes a lot of sense that the students would be very confused with this. They know that he's looking for a correct answer, but they have no idea what the correct answer is. And once again, he uses the technique to scare his students. Cold calling. He just calls on a student. If they get it right, he's very excited for them. Yes! Excellent, good job. If they get it wrong, he makes fun of them. Think about the culture that he's creating in his classroom. To be honest, it's almost like a culture of hazing, right? If I just haze my students, make them scared of me, then they'll have no choice but to sort of bond together and bond with me, and I don't think that's the culture you want to create in a classroom. And there is no revision. We don't come back to that at all. All right, so let's alter this. Let's make this better. Well, the element, let's still make it the life experience of communication. Why not? Let's keep the same element, but I'm going to add an interaction, a frame. Language was invented to blank. Okay, great. And the tool I'm going to use is a rally robin. So I'm going to have students in my class turn towards each other and they have to fill in the blank. Language was invented to blank. Then I would provide think time for students, have them think of 2, 3, 4, 5 things that language could be invented for. And then I have them rally robin back and forth, possible things that language was invented for. And at the end, and this is his kind of funny, kind of really inappropriate response, was to woo woman. All right, then he starts talking about Shakespeare, and his students go, oh, Shakespeare. And the idea, he wants them to think of it as potentially interesting in some way, but he just talks. There's really no tool to show that they're thinking about what he's saying, so it's just traditional sit and listen to me talk, which he uses a lot in this movie. So let's mix it up. So we're going to start with an element, and that's memories of the affect of Shakespeare. So how does Shakespeare make you feel? And based on his students' experiences in life, which you would hope they've been exposed to some Shakespeare, it sounds like they have with their groaning, they can think about how they felt about Shakespeare. They're also going to think about some potential movie clips of modern staging. And the frame is going to be what modern ways and voices can be used to stage a play. So in other words, instead of him saying, oh, we could be like John Wayne and using John Wayne's voice, which I get is engaging. It's some inspirational teaching, using some acting, but at the same time, he's doing all the thinking. The students are not. And so the frame is what modern ways and voices can be used to stage a play. And we're going to use a rally robin again. All the students think about multiple ways that they could alter Shakespeare to make it more exciting for a modern audience. And then they rally robin back and forth. I'm taking these traditional toolboxes where one student speaks at a time or the teacher just speaks and not students, and I'm turning them into some interactive microplans. All right, finally, and this is actually why I chose this particular clip, is you show him reading aloud from a novel. The interaction is not stated, it's simply to listen to and think about. And the students are laughing. There is some evidence that they're listening to the book, but it really is some traditional, the teacher is speaking, reading out loud, and students are simply listening. And so let's really get these students involved in reading this book. And so I've got to change the whole thing up. And here I have actually 2 parts to my microplan. So instead of the teacher reading, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have 2 students paired up, and one student is going to read the chunk of text out loud, and the other one is going to illustrate with boarding. So one is reading out loud, the other one is sketching out with diagrams and words, a particular, maybe a page of text, and they're trying to illustrate the visual imagery of that passage. And then they switch. The other one reads the exact same passage out loud, and the other one illustrates. The tool is going to be closed boarding on this one, so while they're illustrating, I want them to hold their board back, not show their partner. That way we're going to get 2 very different illustrations. Okay, so when they switch roles, the partner hides the board and doesn't show the illustration, and which actually makes for some great feedback and revision. And so what happens now is we do something called consensus boarding. So the students show their boards, and then they go ahead and look at and add to their board based on what their partner did. Okay, so that they end up with one beautiful sketch of what was happening in the scene. That forced my students to be involved in that particular reading of the text. It forced them to visually imagine what was happening during that particular reading. And then let's push them. I mean, right now, all students are doing is just thinking about the reading. They're showing some comprehension and they're showing some fluency by their reading and their illustrating. But let's go ahead and make them think about it. So the element for the second round is going to be the memory of the text and real-world experience. So now they have a good memory of the text because they've sketched it, they've heard it twice, right? They've consensused with their partners, and now they have the memory of the text, and they're going to have to use their real-world experience to answer this question. And here's the interaction. They're going to rewrite this chunk of text from a modern perspective in a modern situation. And we're relating this to what he was talking about with Shakespeare, making things more modern and more accessible to a modern public. So the text we're using is very old. It's based on old ideas and old situations. And so the idea is on our whiteboards, because we're doing 3-hour whiteboarding, using open boarding so they can actually help each other out, they're going to rewrite this chunk of text as best as they can using a more modern tone, using more modern events. Okay, so that's some pretty high-level thinking right there, right? You got to analyze it and you got to create your own based on your real-world experience and based on what you read in the text. Now, what's going to happen is I'm going to use some immediate feedback. Partway through, I'm going to have students stand up and they're going to take their second board. So if you've watched the 3 Higher Whiteboarding series, there's something called double boarding, where students have a smaller board called a feedback board. So they leave their response board on their table, they take their feedback board with them. Then they walk around and they read what other students are doing with that chunk of text. They are allowed then on their feedback board to write down some notes for some ways that they could improve their own board. Then after a little bit of time, I tell students to go back to their seats. Using what they wrote on their feedback board, they need to revise and improve their chunk of text that they're writing. So see, there's some great peer feedback there. Students see how other peers are doing and then they come back to create things on their own board. And then this can continue this way. Students can continue to rewrite and to learn, and we're going to continue the same type of micro-planning with the next chunk of text and the next chunk of text. Notice it takes longer, right? This isn't as simple as just, I'm going to read this out loud and you're going to go ahead and listen to me. But at the same time, it's much more engaging. It pushes students to a higher level. They're not just sitting there laughing. Now, there's always a time for you to listen and enjoy a text, but at the same time, what are students really learning? And in this particular case, they're using a higher level thinking skill to adapt to the text for a more modern world. And I think that ties in with the other lessons that he was giving before, is how do we make these old texts become more relevant to today? Which is what I think was really what Mr. Keating was going for, is he wanted to show his students that these old texts that we're reading, they're supposed to be exciting, and they're supposed to relate to students' real life and real world. And so I hope you can see how I took that one scene from a movie, some pretty typical things that happen in a reading classroom, and I've altered the micro-plan in order to change the culture of the classroom, in order to change what students are thinking about, in order to change the levels that they're thinking about it, in order to change the engagement levels with the tools, in order to add some great feedback and revision. All right, moving on to math. And I have chosen one of my favorite all-time teacher movies, which is Stand and Deliver. And it's a movie about Jaime Escalante, who was an amazing math teacher in California. And also it's a great movie with James Edward Olmos. And so hopefully you've seen this movie. If you haven't seen it, before watching this, go watch the whole movie. It's pretty inspirational. But at the same time, the teaching that is showcased in that movie is not so great. While Mr. Escalante had very high expectations for his students, in the movie it shows them using some very traditional methods of teaching. So let's go ahead and watch the movie clip. Remember, I'm going to be scripting out the micro-plan below it, so as the movie clip plays, I'll go ahead and change the micro-plan so you can see what it looks like. Let's watch Jaime Escalante in Stand and Deliver.
What you got?
It's an apple.
How much?
What do you mean?
What you got?
Half.
Good. Excuse me my German accent. What you got?
Missing 25%?
What?
Missing 25%.
That's right. Missing 25%. Is it true intelligent people make better lovers?
Hey, what you got?
I got a core.
You owe me 100%. I'll see you in the People's Court. Everyone, please open your book, chapter 2, page 26. Multiplication of fractions and percentages. 25%, 50%, 75%.
All right, let's go from shades of gray into color and let's alter this lesson. So we start with sliced apples, which I think is a great real-world touch. So some more inspirational teaching. He's also dressed up, so that relates to some inspirational teaching. But his question, his interaction is very odd. What you got? Okay, not very clear, but that's okay. We want to try using some more academic language, but what you got puts students on edge. And once again, the theme of this, the tool, is cold calling. And so the idea in these movies seems to be, if you're working with tough students, just get them a little bit scared. Put them on the edge, and then it'll create an amazing classroom culture. So once again, it's almost like, hey, let's haze your students into caring about school. Well, there are much better ways to get students to care about school than making them feel on edge, making them feel slightly scared. If you know that you're going to be cold called at any time and you know you have the wrong answer, that's not creating a good culture. That's creating a culture of being scared. The amygdala turns on, it turns off the front of your brain, and suddenly, even when you're called on, if you know the answer, you don't have the ability to speak it. And it's funny, as part of this clip, you can see that with the girl in the back of the room. You can tell her amygdala is going off like crazy, right? She is scared. And so instead of saying her answer loudly and proudly, she says it very soft and meek. And he doesn't necessarily do a lot to help with that. And then not only that, but then he says some sort of sexist statement once again about gentlemen liking the ladies that are intelligent. I think with today's modern perspective, we look back at some of this writing and we think to ourselves, why was this in the movie? Why did they include that? A little bit of sexism once again going on. All right, so he cold calls students with apples. The immediate feedback was a follow-up question. He gives lots of praise if they're correct, and he says something funny if they're not correct. And I suppose that is Mr. Escalante's way in this movie of getting his students to relax, is using humor when they are wrong. But I'm telling you, there are better ways to make it so that students have support when they're wrong, rather than just laughing it off. All right, so let's mess with this. Here we go. We're going to start with the same element. Heck yeah, let's have some sliced up apples for fractions. And every student has an apple that's sliced in a different way. Now, the frame, we're going to give students some higher academic vocabulary when they are responding. So they can say the percentage of the apple gone is blank, or the percentage of the apple left is blank. Those are two great frames that students can fill in order to use some higher level vocabulary. Notice, I'm giving the students the words that they need to say to use that academic vocabulary. Now the tool, this is perfect for this. It's out of the Kagan toolbox and it's called Quiz Quiz Trade. And this is another thing where I need to say, I'm not a Kagan trainer, but you gotta go get yourself trained. All right, go take that 4 or 5 day training. If you're in Las Vegas, every single year around February, there's a 4-day winter academy. I think it's at the New Orleans this year. I talked to my principal and he's paying for it. And I've got actually 5 teachers going with me for this 4-day amazing training. And I've gone every single year. It's just amazing to continue to be trained in these really, really cool engaging methods. All right, so how Quiz Quiz Trade works is students will approach each other and each of them will have an apple. And what happens is, one student asks the other students, what you got? Or what percentage do you have? And the other student needs to answer the percentage of the apple gone is, or the percentage of the apple left is. Okay, so one student answers, then the other student answers. If they both get it right, they praise and say, hey, good job. And then they trade apples. And then they go to the next person, they put their hand up, they find the next person, and then they quiz, and trade apples. Now, built in is that if students mess it up or they get it wrong, there is peer feedback built in. There is coaching. So if a student messes up during Quiz Quiz Trade, the other student is going to coach them using some questions, using some tips. I recommend some Socratic questioning for students to help them out. Socratic tutoring is a great method where they're allowed to ask questions, but they're not allowed to say anything else. In Kagan Cooperative Learning, they use something called T to the 4th, which is tip, tip, teach, try again, where you give 1 tip, you give 2 tips, you now teach it all the way, and then they have to try it again. And that's actually where that revision part is built in. If they get it wrong at the end, they have to reteach it. And so Quiz Quiz Trade has some great immediate feedback and revision built in with peers. Now, if we're talking about high-risk cooperative learning, I want you to understand something. Okay, here's the way I do this in my classroom. I never have all my students standing up at one time. What I have is half the class is seated, and the other half is seated with them. And then what happens is either the A or the B stands up, finds an empty chair, and sits down. So this helps with cooperative learning in older students' classrooms and more high-risk classrooms. Okay, is that when they're done quizzing and trading, one student stands up, finds the next empty chair, and sits down. So at any one point, I only have maybe 3, 4, or 5 students up and moving around. That makes it much easier to facilitate the Quiz Quiz Trade. I used to not enjoy this structure because it could lead to some crazy controlled chaos. But when students are seated and only a few stand up and move around at the same time, it actually makes it for a beautiful structure. And I've been using this one with middle schoolers for a long time now. It's a great structure to use. And if Jaime Escalante had used this structure in his classroom, all of his students would have been able to practice using some high academic vocabulary, how much of the apple is left, and it would have been great. And the peer feedback would have been built in. Now, near the end of this clip, you can hear Mr. Escalante going on to the traditional math approach, which is this. He says, okay, we're going up to chapter 2, page 26, multiplication of fractions and percentages, questions 1 through 10. So I'm guessing he's about to transition to some independent work. Now, that scares me a little bit for a couple reasons. Number one, he hasn't actually taught them multiplication and division of fractions. He taught them percentages of an apple. And so his lesson isn't really tying things together. Right. So I've taken now this traditional approach to math where he's going to have them solve 10 questions independently. I'm pretty sure that's what's about to happen. Or he might even say, work with your partners. A little bit of unstructured group work, which is not good for kids. And let's break it up. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to alter this. So they're going to turn to chapter 2, page 26, 1 through 10. Same thing, right? We're still going to use the same elements in that textbook. We're going to start by breaking apart what students have to think about. So the first step is going to be steps to multiply fractions. He hasn't really taught them the steps, okay? So the interaction with this is going to be to remember them. Now, this is going to be a memory-based interaction, so I want to use some of my whole brain teaching. So here's what I would do. Mirror words, multiplying fractions, multiplying fractions, multiplying fractions, numerator, denominator, multiplying fractions. Okay, here's how we multiply fractions. Ready? Okay, cross the top, cross the bottom. All right, how do we multiply fractions? Cross the top, cross the bottom. I clap, clap, and say teach. Students clap, clap, and say okay. And then they turn and teach each other. Multiply fractions across the top, across the bottom. Multiplying fractions, numerator, denominator. Okay, so then they teach each other back and forth using those movements. Now, if we're talking about dividing fractions, I would probably start with flip and then multiply. But I'm teaching my students to remember those steps using what I know about whole brain teaching and the movement. So now that we've memorized the basic steps, let's move on to the second part. So we're now going to solve a problem one step at a time. Okay, my students haven't multiplied fractions before. They looked at apples and percentages, but I need to get them to multiply fractions. And so I'm going to take each individual step to multiply in problem one. So we're all going to do problem one together. Okay, and we're going to solve the next step. And the way we're going to do that is a series of some TLAC turn-and talks. And so I'm going to say to students, okay, the first step is we multiply across the top. Okay, turn and talk, work with your partners, do that now, ready, set, go. Okay, now students have open boarding, and while they're doing that, I'm going to walk around, and once again, I'm going to list off some positive things that are happening. I mean, this is a very small amount of time needed to multiply across the top, but that's fine. It's the first time we're doing it. Okay, then I'm going to say the second step, and what is it? Multiply across the bottom. All right, turn and talk to your partners, multiply across the bottom. Ready, set, go. Okay, and then the next step, check your fraction. Is it a mixed number? And hopefully we've worked on mixed numbers before, right? Or is it an improper fraction? Do we need to turn it into a mixed number? Or does it need to be reduced? So there's these last steps that we need to take after we've multiplied the fractions. And each one of those would be a turn and talk with a partner. They do the step on their whiteboard, and then there's open boarding during that. And the teacher walks around and gives some positivity as they're walking around. Notice, as these steps are going on, my immediate feedback will be the teacher board. So up top on the screen, I'm going to have a fake board, which I've shown you in the last video. And as they do the steps, I'm going to slowly show them what the steps look like on my board. So they don't just get peer feedback, they also get teacher feedback. And then they fix their board as they need it. All right, so now we've done one problem together slowly. We've had our partner support. And now we're going to do problems 2 through 10. And we're going to use some Kagan. We're going to use the structure called Sage and Scribe, where student A tells student B what to write on their whiteboard. B can always coach if student A is getting it wrong, but then they switch. And then student A is going to write on the whiteboard, and student B is going to tell them what to write. It's called Sage and Scribe. So they take turns being the sage, they take turns being the scribe, and the peer feedback is built in. Okay, so notice there's peer support. We don't go to independent practice. We've really just started this, and it's not time to have students independently practice. The ones that get it will continue to get it during independent practice, and the ones that didn't, they have no peer support built in. So they're going to sit there, they're probably going to misbehave, because students would rather misbehave than admitting they don't know how to do something, right? And so the culture of the classroom is going to tank. We're going to have a lot of students that they're going to mask their behavior. We call it masking behavior. They're going to mask the ability that they can't do multiplying fractions. Well, because honestly, he didn't really teach to multiply fractions, right? So they're going to misbehave. And if I have the peer support built in, there's less of a chance for that to actually happen. All right, so see what I've done. I've taken some very traditional do questions 1 through 10 independently, and I've turned it into a series of well-designed micro-planning steps, ending with some Kagan cooperative learning. And what I love about this is we've actually used all 4 toolboxes to design this. We used whole brain teaching to get them to remember. We used TLAC and 3 Higher to get them to work together and give some peer and teacher feedback and support. And now we're using some cooperative learning, some Kagan at the end, in order to continue that peer support. And so it's a beautiful micro design. I have a feeling if Jaime Escalante had organized his lessons in this way, he would have had a much more successful time with some of his students. All right, next let's look at social studies. And I'm thinking back to the movie Pay It Forward. Now, unfortunately, Kevin Spacey was in this movie, and he's turned out to be one of Hollywood's biggest villains for some of the crazy stuff that he's done. But that being said, I can villainize him as a teacher as well, because his micro plans are not great during this lesson. In fact, I hate the culture that Mr. Spacey has created in his classroom. But this is one of the movies I remember watching and thinking, wow, this was videotaped in Las Vegas. And actually one of the schools that I used to teach at, they videotaped some of the scenes in it, so I can kind of recognize it. But let's look at this social studies lesson real quick, and it's not great. It's not great. So let's watch this clip, and you'll notice there's a lot of very traditional tools being used in my micro planning below.
This class is social studies. That is you and the world. Yes, there is a world out there, and even if you decide you don't want to meet it, it's still going to hit you right in the face. Believe me. So, best you start thinking about the world now and what it means to you. What does the world mean to you? Come on, a little class participation here. Is it just this class you want to get out of? Your house, your street? Any further any of you want to go than that? Yes?
The mall. That's only like 2 miles away from me.
Well, let me ask you another question. How often do you think about things that happen outside of this town? You watch the news? Yes? No? All right, so we're not global thinkers yet, but why aren't we?
Because we're 11.
Good point. What's your name?
Trevor.
Maybe Trevor is absolutely right. Why should we think about the world? I mean, after all, what does the world expect of us?
Expect.
Mm-hmm. Of you. What does the world expect of you?
Nothing.
Nothing. My God, boys and girls, he's absolutely right. Nothing. I mean, here you are, you can't drive, you can't vote, you can't even go to the bathroom without a pass from me. You're stuck right here in the 7th grade. But not forever, because one day you'll be free. All right, but what if on that day you're free, you haven't prepared, you're not ready, and then you look around you and you don't like what the world is? What if the world is just a big disappointment?
We're screwed.
Unless you take the things that you don't like about this world and you flip them upside down right on their ass. Don't tell your parents I used that word. And you can start that today. This is your assignment. Extra credit. It goes on all year long. Now, wait a minute. What? What's wrong with this? What's the matter? Yes?
It's like so...
So what? There must be a word to finish that sentence. Someone help her?
Weird. Crazy.
Weird. Crazy.
Hard. Bummer.
Bummer. Hard.
Extremely traditional, extremely disengaging. In fact, students start cheering that they're going to be done with school soon. Yay! That's not a good thing. We have to remember as teachers that our students come to us with certain mindsets. And one of those mindsets might be to hate school and to not want to come to school. Our job is to sell the idea that they should love coming to school. That school is a place where they can learn and they can thrive, and it's a place where they shouldn't be judged, and it's a place that's going to lead them to amazing things in their future. That's what I believe part of our job is as teachers. But that's the persuader part of me talking. So let's look at how we can change the microplan to try to change the culture in the classroom that this guy has been creating. You'll notice a lot of the elements that this teacher uses are life experience. And it's almost not fair. Once again, there's a little bit of this hazing element to this, where it's almost like the teacher is judging the students' lack of life experiences. These students are 11, 12, 13 years old. How much life experience did you have at the age of 11, 12, or 13? Right? Many of these students have probably never ventured outside of this town where they're teaching. And sometimes we forget how little life experience we had when we were young. And as a teacher, he belittles students for it. He makes fun of them for it. It's almost like he is setting himself up as the all-knowing source of wisdom in the classroom, and students are the insignificant peons in the classroom. And it's really kind of a disgusting culture that this teacher starts to create. And so, yeah, the first one is the idea that students should care about the world, assuming that they don't care about the world at all and their life experience is so limited and the world's going to hit them in the face one day. And it's just another version of something you always hear from teachers. The real world's going to come and get you, kid. Well, guess what? The real world isn't as scary as people make it out to be. There's tons of supports in the real world. The interaction while he's talking about the real world is not stated. He's just talking and they're listening. So let's change this lesson up, all right? I can't even mess with his lesson because it is just so abhorrently horrible. What we're going to do is I'm going to change up my elements entirely. I don't want my students thinking about how much the world sucks. So my elements are going to be some inspiring child speakers from some TED speeches, or some articles on amazing teens that have accomplished amazing things. Okay, so I want my students to start thinking that, yes, it is possible when I'm young to make great changes in this world. There are some amazing TED Talks with some students that have done some amazing things in this world, and so I want my students to think about it. My interaction is going to be some illustrative boarding. The tool is called a whiteboard, watch, jot, and teach. So while students are watching the TED video, they're going to sketch in pictures and words the things that they hear and see in the video. And then they're going to go ahead and turn and teach their partners some things they learned from the TED Talk. I just don't want my students watching an inspirational video. I want them to prove that they have thought about it and they've interacted with it in some way. And so while illustrative boarding is a very simple Bloom's or very simple DOK, at the same time, it really helps with students in their memory, and it helps them focus while they're watching a 6-7 minute TED video. For the revision, I'm going to use consensus boarding again. When students are done watching and jotting, they're going to compare with their partners and they're going to add to their boards things that they missed. All right, the next part of his lesson is, once again, the element is life experience. What do you know, kid? It's kind of what he keeps insinuating. The interaction is, what does the world mean to you? How far do you want to go? How often do you think about the things outside of this town? Do you watch the news? It's like he's insinuating and attacking students with his questions. And then, of course, he uses the raised hand, where one student speaks and the rest listen. And I think the student's response is, the mall? Well, for that particular student, the mall might be the most exciting place they've ever been. Okay, we can't judge students for their life experiences. Our job as teachers is to enrich their life experiences. All right, so there is really no immediate feedback. In fact, it's simply derision. The teacher finds a way to communicate to students the derision he has towards them and their life experiences. Once again, setting himself up as the all-knowing wise teacher while they are just the little peon middle schoolers. So let's change it up. Here's the element. I'm going to provide students with cards with local, state, national, and international headlines featuring potential problems around the world. Students are going to describe a possible approach to help solve these problems based on 4 particular approaches that we're going to learn about before we do this. So there is a piece where I have to teach my students about these 4 different ways to change the world. I almost feel like what he's doing is he's setting students up for failure. Right? He's not really giving them a specific approach that they could take to change the world. And so an education campaign, a slogan campaign, a grassroots action campaign, or a global action campaign, we would have to learn about those 4 different approaches to try to solve a problem. Okay, so then students have these cards. Each one has a card with a different problem on it based off headlines from articles. And then we're going to do what's called travel and trade. So students, once again, are going to pair up, kind of like in Quiz Trade. They're going to find another student, and they're going to go ahead and brainstorm ways that they could solve this particular problem that's on the card. Okay, so this student has an idea, and then the other student has an idea, and then they trade cards. In terms of traveling, when a student is done, they would raise their card up in the air, they look for another student with a card up in the air, and then they pair up with them. And then they work once again to try to figure out, hey, what could we try to do to solve these problems that we find in the headlines? Notice the immediate feedback is built in. They're paired up with other peers, and their peers are going to help them figure out some different ways they could approach different problems. And then the revision. So they continue to trade cards. They continue to try over and over and over again to try to come up with ideas to solve these problems. And they're slowly getting feedback from their peers, and hopefully those solutions are starting to get better and better and better as we continue our travel and trade. All right, the final element, once again, is back to life experiences, and he says, hey, we need an idea for how to change the world. And he gives these inspirational words to build students up, says, hey, you can change the world, but he doesn't actually give them any structure. He doesn't give them any scaffolding to help them figure out how they could do this project. I mean, this to me is the laziest teaching I've ever seen. He literally came into class, wrote a couple words on the whiteboard and said, hey, this is my lesson for today. It's just lazy teaching. You got to help students. If you're giving them this gigantic, huge, year-long project, you have to help them do the project. So the interaction is going to be to design a project to change the world. Okay, so why not? Let's just stick with that. And now he has it as independent work. So students are just going to work on their own to do that. And who knows how they're going to do it. So let's change it up. We're going to take a chosen project that can help the community. So once they've taken those headlines, they're going to be in teams, and they're going to do what's called a cooperative project. And they're going to conduct a year-long project to help with this issue. But there's going to be lots and lots and lots of tasks, and there's lots of checklists that students need to go through. It's done in stages, and each stage as they go through this project, they're going to get feedback from the teacher, feedback from their peers, and then the revision is going to be they're going to adjust their project throughout the school year. You can't just introduce students with this independent work project and not support them. And so while I understand that this particular microplan is really more of a massive year-long plan, I just wanted to get across the idea that you can't just give students a project or something big and not give them some support. All right, the last one we're going to look at is writing, and the movie we're going to look at is Freedom Writers. This particular movie, Freedom Writers with Hilary Swank, is pretty problematic. There's a savior complex sometimes that comes to teachers that go and they teach in high poverty areas. And for me, it was always, I just wanted to provide any and all students with an amazing instructional and educational experience. I wanted them to have an amazing science experience like I had. I wanted them to love science, and I wanted them to learn. And to me, it didn't matter where they were in the income brackets or where they lived or where their zip code was. My idea was I just wanted to be a great and amazing teacher. The thing about this particular movie, Freedom Writers, is you can definitely tell that Erin Gruel has the mindset of, I'm going into these problematic schools with these problematic kids, and I'm going to save the world. And that's just not the right mindset to have as a teacher teaching in schools with students that happen to have issues due to poverty. This quote just reminds me of this mindset. And she said, I grew up in a very progressive family with a great educational system. And I asked myself, why doesn't everybody have these opportunities for a good education? So why not give back to these kids who didn't grow up with the same privileges I had? It's a very deficit way of looking at students. And when we get to our next stabilizer video, I'm going to talk about looking at students as having assets. And I think that asset teaching is what really helps us. For example, there might be a student whose parents are unemployed, and so they're not making any money right now, and they're doing the best they can to survive. And guess what asset that student has? The asset that student has is they have an amazing abuela, an amazing grandma who is there for them all the time, and let's say takes them to church, so they have a spiritual asset as well. And so they have a great family and community connection, which is more of an asset than many of us might have growing up. So regardless of the money, regardless of the situation, different students have different assets and different deficits. I am trying to look at the assets that all my students have, because guess what? I also have assets and I also have deficits. And so when we start looking at students in this way, we stop thinking about them as these poor, misguided students that need my direction. And so I want to look at a scene from Freedom Writers, and this is now, we're looking at writing, and a very traditional thing that you might see in a writing class.
Ms. G, can I read something from my diary?
That'd be great.
Who is he?
Man, he's been with us since freshman year, fool.
What's his name?
I don't know.
The summer was the worst summer in my short 14 years of life. It all started with a phone call. My mother was crying and begging, asking for more time, as if she were gasping for her last breath of air. She held me as tight as she could and cried. Her tears hit my shirt like bullets and told me we were being evicted. She kept apologizing to me. I thought I have no home. I should have asked for something less expensive at Christmas. On the morning of the eviction, a hard knock on the door woke me up. The sheriff was there to do his job. I looked up at the sky, waiting for something to happen. My mother has no family to lean on, no money coming in. Why bother coming to school or getting good grades if I'm homeless? The bus stops in front of the school. I feel like throwing up. I'm wearing clothes from last year, some old shoes and no new haircut. I kept thinking I'd get laughed at. Instead, I'm greeted by a couple of friends who were in my English class last year. And it hits me, Mrs. Gerwell, my crazy English teacher from last year, is the only person that made me think of hope. Talking with friends about last year's English and our trips, I began to feel better. I received my schedule and the first teacher is Mrs. Gerwell in room 203. I walk into the room and feel as though all the problems in life are not so important anymore.
So let's take a look at the microplanning in this scene, and then we'll go ahead and bring it over the rainbow and redesign the microplan. Pretty typical. A student is presenting, right, reading out loud. So let's go ahead and mess with this. Let's defy some tradition. All right, so the element, a student's diary entry about real world emotional events, and also his love for the teacher in the class. That's a great element. That's awesome. The interaction is not stated, so students are just sitting there. Hopefully they're listening, but we have no idea if they are. The tool is one student presents while the rest listen. You can see them nicely and silently listening to the student reading the journal entry. We have one student presenting their writing to the class. Let's mess with this. All right, so we're gonna keep the same element first, the student's diary entry about the real world with emotional events, and we're gonna provide some thinking and speaking frames. So when the student is done presenting, they're gonna say one way I relate to the story is, or one way I do not relate to the story is, and they're gonna fill in that blank. And so the student presents, and then we do a rally robin. Oh, one way I relate to the story is, or one way I don't relate to the story is. And they go back and forth and back and forth. I mean, that's one way at least to get the students at the end of the presentation to interact. And what I would do is I would say beforehand, okay folks, after he's done reading the story, we're going to answer this question. How do you relate to it? How do you not relate to it? Okay, go ahead and read your story and let's think while he's doing that. Notice it's a thinking frame, right? I haven't told them what they're gonna do with it yet, but they're gonna think about it as he's reading it. Okay, well now this is a great micro plan for this particular student presenting. I wanna mess with this even more because there's a lot of problems with what's happening in that classroom right now. You'll notice he's the one reading his journal. Everyone else is just sort of sitting there and watching and listening. Let's get the whole class involved. And so I'm gonna totally redesign this lesson, and we're gonna redesign this into 4 micro plans. So the first one is gonna be, we're gonna start with the memory of a traumatic event. So all students are gonna think about a traumatic event they've had in their life. They're gonna write 1 paragraph at a time. And we're gonna use some TLAC, and we're going to use Everybody Writes. Okay, so thinking about this memory of a traumatic event, I think as a teacher I might have them use some thinking maps first, but either way you can have students simply start writing. So they're gonna start writing 1 little paragraph at a time. You might tell them, okay, this is your introductory paragraph and here's what this would look like, and now let's go ahead and write it. While they're writing, you're gonna do some rigorous monitoring. You're gonna walk around and you're gonna look for sentences that aren't well developed and ask them to elaborate and add some more words to their sentences, or ask them some questions to get them to think about more things they could write. The revision is while you're doing your rigorous monitoring, they're gonna cross out and revise parts of their paragraph. Then we're gonna go to part 2. So the element is going to be the journal draft of a traumatic event. So they've made a draft, maybe a 3-paragraph story, or a 3-paragraph journal. The interaction is, they're going to create some questions that could still be answered. And we're going to use our Kagan toolbox and use what's called a strolling pair share. So instead of one student reading to the whole class, we're going to pair up. And then strolling means they're just going to walk around the room together. This is another one of those high-risk Kagan things where if students are walking side by side, they don't have to make a lot of eye contact, and it makes it an easier social situation. And so what happens is those 2 students walk around, maybe they could even walk outside, you could take them to another location. One student reads, and then the other student reads the journal. And so it's a strolling pair share. Now that's going to turn into a strolling pair interview. So once they're done reading their journals to each other, they start asking each other questions about the story. And the questions that they ask are going to help them figure out what more do I have to include in the story. Now notice the feedback's built in there. Their partner is going to ask them questions to help them figure out what to add to the story. Because if a question is being asked, then obviously they could include that information in their story. And then our revision is going to happen. They're now going to make their next draft based on the questions that were asked. We don't want to spend all our time having students interact with just their memory of traumatic events, right? We want to get them to improve their writing, to add some more great writing skills. And so we're going to add some literary devices. And we're going to use some whole brain in order to get them to remember those literary devices. And hopefully we've introduced some to them before. And so I might say mirror words, simile, kinda like, simile, this is like this, simile, this is like this. And so we're reviewing similes. Okay, this is the definition of a simile. And you could have students add metaphors or onomatopoeia or maybe some personification or any other literary element you can think of. Notice I'm accessing the memory of that first. So students have to be taught these devices first. They know what they are. We're using the whole brain toolbox, so it might be simile, is like, and then you clap twice and say teach, they clap twice and say okay, and they teach each other back and forth. So now that they've been reminded of similes, we're going to add more to their story. And so what I have going on now is we have our second journal draft of our traumatic events and the memory of using literary devices. So we have those two together. And we're going to add some literary devices to the sentences in their story. And what I'm going to ask them to do is to, on their whiteboard, I'd like you to write a new sentence you can add into your story that uses this literary device. One sentence at a time using open boarding, students are going to go ahead and write down a sentence that they could add to their story using those literary devices. Now, I'm also going to have the teacher board up top, so I've also written a journal writing. I'm going to show them a sentence I would add to my story. Okay, so I'm demonstrating for students what I would do. We're also going to have a whiteboard walk. So when they're done writing their sentences, they're going to stand up, they're going to walk around the room, and they're going to look at different sentences that students have written. Then they're going to go back to their board and they're going to be able to revise it to make an even better sentence. And then when we're done with that, we're going to create our third draft, adding some of those literary device sentences. So look at what I've done here. I have taken what used to be one student reading while the rest just sit there and watch. I've turned it into a beautiful cycle of journaling where we use different writing techniques, where all students are engaged, all students are able to share their stories with each other, where they ask each other questions, they revise their writing. I've reminded them of some literary devices, and we're going to use that to change our writing and make it even better. And so I've turned what was once just this supposed lesson where one student is reading and the rest are just listening, and I've turned it into a real writing lesson using micro-planning. All right, I hope you got something from this, seeing some traditional methods and seeing how I have altered them slightly. What's going to help you out a lot on these is if you go and you watch some 3 Higher Whiteboarding videos that I created, take a Kagan training. You could also go to Kagan Online and you can sign up for, there's these online videos you can watch as well, Kagan On Demand, and that can teach you about how to use some of these structures as well. I've done 10 years of trainings and lots of practice, and so it takes time to be able to plan and use Kagan like I've done. You could watch some whole brain teaching videos or buy one of Chris Biffle's books or go on his website of whole brain teaching and learn some of those methods that I was using as well. You could buy a Teach Like a Champion 3.0 book or go online and look for Uncommon Schools and watch some of the video clips of those tools being used. That's really, I think, the hard part is mastering those tools and knowing when to use them. And I created these micro plans in just a matter of moments using my imagination, thinking about these teachers and what they did and revising their lessons using what I know about the tools and what I know about elements, interactions, tools, feedback, and revision. All right, so I'm going to end this with a coaching sheet like I've done before, and we're talking about micro-planning, the McAlpine frame. So it's a specific way to design moment-by-moment interactions. That's what we've learned, including elements, interactions, tools, feedback, and revision. The big why for this, classroom culture is directly influenced by what we teach and how we teach it. So carefully crafting those micro moments helps create a moment-by-moment culture in our classroom that's positive, that's engaged, and all students are accountable. In terms of practice, you could take an upcoming lesson and list out micro plans and work to alter those micro plans before you teach the lesson to better engage those students, and you can practice planning each component of the McAlpine frame. Another thing you could do to practice is you could watch a video of your teaching. In terms of active coaching, coach can suggest different micro planning adjustments on the spot in the classroom and have the teachers repeat small moments of instruction. I think one of the better things to do as a coach is to video record a part of a teacher's lesson and then sit down with them and sketch out the microplan with them. And then once it's sketched out, come up with ideas for how they could alter this particular microplan and then apply that to future lessons. That's a great way to coach this. In terms of systematic support, I think it's a good idea to have your coaches and your administrators go around and perform walkthroughs in classrooms and sketch out the microplans across your school. And so you'll get a good picture of what tools are being used, how balanced are your interactions, what about the elements? What are students mostly thinking about? Is it simple stuff? Is it hard stuff? Is it memory-based? Is it simple memory-based? Interactions. Are your teachers using a good balance between knowledge and higher-level thinking? Or are they only using knowledge? Or are they only using higher-level thinking? I think both are just as bad. What kind of tools are you seeing? Is it all traditional tools, right? And then are students really getting immediate feedback and are they able to revise? Or do we have things like independent work where they turn stuff in or they don't get any feedback at all? Now it's important when you're doing that you use them as walkthroughs. Don't record teachers' names. You're just recording trends that you see. And then as a school, you can make some plans and some goals for how you could change those micro plans when you do your next walk in a couple weeks. So that's a great systematic way to support this. So in the back we have the 11 parts of doing some great micro planning. So the elements must be chunked and specific. It's going to be clear what students must think about. The elements must involve memories, including enriched whole brain memories. In terms of interactions, the tasks, questions, and frames are clearly spelled out and chunked for students. The teacher maintains a balance of lower level and higher level thinking, and they connect knowledge to skill. The teacher rarely utilizes traditional and transitional toolboxes. They use them still, right? You need to use them, but this is a rare thing. They tend to use other more engaging and more accountable tools. They do so when it's appropriate, but it does not compromise classroom culture. The teacher then successfully utilizes different toolboxes. So there's a check mark for whole brain, Kagan, 3-higher whiteboarding, and so those are the 3 I have here. Immediate feedback. Does it come from both peers and the teacher? And is it built into the majority of your moment-by-moment plans? All right, immediate feedback doesn't have to be in everything. It should be in the majority of your micro plans. Is revision built in to the majority of those plans as well? Do students not just get feedback, but do they have to show that they've taken in that feedback? And then finally, the overarching goal, the strong majority of the micro plans create a 95 to 100% engaged, active, positive classroom culture through accountability and simultaneous interaction. All right, that's Classroom Culture 111. Look at micro planning in this culture series. I hope you enjoyed it. To me, it's one of the most important things to creating an amazing culture in your classroom, but it's definitely an analyzer thing. So you got to spend extra time looking at your teaching and trying to look at those micro plans and design good micro plans. All right, everyone, have a great week teaching. It's been great talking to you. I hope you got something from this. I do value feedback and comments, so please add them below. I'd love to hear from you, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great day.
Why do I stand up here? Anybody?
To feel taller.
No. Thank you for playing, Mr. Dalton. I stand upon my desk to remind myself that we must constantly look at things in a different way. See, the world looks very different from up here. You don't believe me? Come see for yourselves. Come on. Come on. Just when you think you know something, you have to look at it in another way. Even though it may seem silly or wrong, you must try. Now, when you read, don't just consider what the author thinks. Consider what you think. Boys, you must strive to find your own voice. Because the longer you wait to begin, the less likely you are to find it at all. Thoreau said most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Don't be resigned to that. Break out. Now don't just walk off the edge like lemmings. Look around you. There you go, Mr. Christie. Thank you. Yes. Dare to strike out and find new ground. Now, in addition to your essays, I would like you to compose a poem of your own, an original work. That's right. You have to deliver it aloud in front of the class on Monday. Bon chance, gentlemen. Mr. Anderson, don't think that I don't know that this assignment scares the hell out of you, you mole.